Great. Hello, everyone. So welcome to our virtual event space. My name is Allie. You might recognize me from our Lake Forest Park location, and I am your host for this evening. I am so excited to be introducing Daniel James Brown and Tom Ikeda here to discuss Daniel's new book, Facing the Mountain, for our annual Community Reads event. So Shoreline and Richmond Beach libraries have joined with Lake Forest Park's Reads again this year, marking the 17th year of this community literary event, sponsored by the King County Library System, the City of Lake Forest Park's Library Advisory Committee, friends of the Shoreline, Richmond Beach, and Lake Forest Park libraries, and of course, their place books. So on behalf of all of us, I just want to thank you all so very much for tuning in. For those of you who may not know, we are an independent bookstore with 3 locations in the Seattle area. We are having more and more events in person, which is so exciting, but our online event program is sticking around to connect readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in and buying books. Your support is what makes all of this possible. So if you haven't gotten your hands on any of the books that come up this evening and you would like to, I will be linking books in chat. For those of you in the Seattle area, come on in, grab a copy off the shelf, or you can place an order online and come pick them up in store. Or if you're not local or not leaving the house, we of course do ship. So go ahead and follow those links in chat to our website. While you're over on our website, I definitely encourage you to check out some of our other upcoming events. We have a very exciting roster coming up this summer and into the fall. So if you'd like to stay in touch with our community, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's a weekly update about events and exciting releases, our book clubs, and of course, follow us on any of the social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations, and we do have a pretty good time on there. So if you would like to check them out, see if there's anything on social media that's good for you. So tonight we're here for about an hour, and towards the end we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we always so hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should be either at the top or bottom of your screen. It is different than your chat box, which is great for virtual applause and connecting with each other. I absolutely invite you to share where you're tuning in from in chat. But when it comes time for questions, do make sure those end up in the Q&A so we can most easily find them. While you're in our chat and question spaces, I do want to remind everyone to please lead with kindness and refrain from any inappropriate behavior or harassment. And finally, should any technical issues arise, we will work as quickly as we can to resolve them. And we so appreciate your patience and understanding. All right, so it is time now for us all to settle in, because without further ado, I am so pleased to welcome Daniel James Brown, the #1 New York Times bestselling author of beloved books, including The Boys in the Boat, The Indifferent Stars Above, Under a Flaming Sky, and of course, the book of the evening, Facing the Mountain. In conversation this evening, I'm so pleased to welcome Tom Ikeda, who wrote the foreword to Facing the Mountain and is the executive director of Densho, a Seattle-based nonprofit dedicated to collecting, preserving, and sharing Japanese American history and promoting social justice and equity. As I've mentioned, the book this evening is Facing the Mountain, an epic story of 4 Japanese American families and their sons who volunteered for military service and displayed uncommon heroism and grit to serve their country, even while their families were incarcerated back home. NPR called it a fascinating, expertly written book, or look at selfless heroes who emerged from one of the darkest periods of American history, soldiers the likes of which this country may never see again. So thank you all so much for being here. Audience members, please do not be shy in chat or in questions. Or if you need anything, of course, I'll be over there keeping an eye. And with that, I'm going to pass the stage to our speakers. So welcome, both of you. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Allie. And so I'm going to kick it off. I'm what we're going to do is I'm going to facilitate a conversation with Dan. And, because this is virtual and we can't see, all the audience, this is going to be kind of a conversation between the two of us as if you weren't there in some ways. But I'll be conscious. So we'll be talking about things to give some context. But I thought it'd be interesting just to, hear the two of us chat about facing the mountain. And so with that, Dan, I'm going to kind of dive in and talk about really the first time we met. And, it's kind of an interesting story. And I wrote about it in the forward where it was, 7 years ago. We were in Seattle at the Seattle Center, and we were at the Mayor's Arts Award. And I was there accepting an award for Densho, the work in preserving the Japanese American story. And you were there for The Boys in the Boat, which I had read at that point. And we were on the stage, and we just started chatting. And you expressed an interest in Japanese American history. And so I thought the first question, and actually I don't think I've really asked this directly, is how did you make the connection? What was it about Japanese American history that made you so interested in writing Facing the Mountain?
So a number of things. Partly it just has to do with my growing up. I grew up with in San Francisco area, and I worked in the flower business. So I had a lot of business associates and friends who were Japanese American and whose parents had been incarcerated during the war. So from very early age, I was always interested in that slice of history and that particular injustice. But my interest was really deepened enormously by what happened actually the evening of that day, because I sat on that stage listening to you, Tom. And Tom, for those who don't know, Tom has for over 25 years now been collecting oral histories, videotaping them, archiving them, making them available on the Densho website. Oral histories of Japanese Americans, particularly those who lived through the World War II years. So I didn't know about anything about Densho, but I sat there listening to you describe, what you did and what this collection was all about. And I went home that evening and I sat down and I got on the Densho site and started to watch and listen to some of these firsthand accounts. And I was just mesmerized by them. I mean, these were deeply personal stories, and they were stories about this kinds of stories I'm drawn to. They were stories about people overcoming great difficulty, people showing enormous amounts of fortitude and resistance, people coming together under hard circumstances. And so in some ways, it reminded me of some of the themes in The Boys in the Boat. I've long been interested in that generation of Americans, and this was sort of another face of that generation, a Japanese American face. So, right from the time I sat down and started listening, I was really pulled deeper than I had ever been in terms of my interest into the history.
I think that's what really intrigued me, because of what I'm going to say right now is your curiosity. I've worked with, over those 25 plus years, with hundreds of authors, filmmakers, web developers, on and on, who wanted to get access to these stories. But with you, and you mentioned you went right away to the stories. You listened, and then the next time we connected, I could tell that you had really listened deeply to these stories, and you had these really interesting questions. And which kind of then brought into this, for me, a fun period where we start talking about the story, because having done this for now 27 years, there are so many stories and so many nuances, and it's such a large story. And it was interesting talking with you, because you asked me, I think, the question, well, is there one person or one family that you could focus on to tell the story? And I said, well, no, I mean, maybe 12 or so, but talk about that process. How did you start slowing that down?
So that was a fun process. And I recall it went on for a long time, like better part of a year, as we went back and forth about this. But yeah, I mean, my problem as a writer was, telling a story, it's always best, if possible, to have sort of one central character around whom the story fits. So I was hoping to find one person, but it quickly became aware that that wasn't possible. And so with a great deal of help from you, I wound up whittling it down to 4 young men and their families. And what I used, what it came down to, and I should say, as it is, there's big pieces of the Japanese-American experience of World War II that aren't in the book because I had to narrow the focus. But what I decided to focus on was young men of draft age. So we're talking about Nisei men who, right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, faced a particular dilemma. Because they were draft age, these are kids that were in high school or just starting college. Most of them had friends who were going off and enlisting. They had neighborhood buddies who were going downtown to the enlistment office, signing up. When they went down and tried to enlist, they were told that they couldn't, that they were something called enemy aliens, even though they were in fact American citizens. So this seemed to me like a really interesting dilemma. I mean, what do you do if you're one of these young men and the families of these young men? Well, how do they react to this situation? So I wound up focusing on, as I say, these 4 young men of draft age. And then there were other considerations like getting somebody from Hawaii and different geographical areas. And so all that involved quite a bit of back and forth to find the right combination of subjects.
Well, so let's start talking about the 4, because I think you did a really interesting, masterful job of with just those 4 of telling a pretty large story, and in a way that brought in all these different perspectives, which to be very honest, I was surprised how well you were able to do that, because the story is so complex, but yet you're able to bring a lot of these things. And a lot of it was because these different perspectives often actually kind of crashed into each other in terms of some of these issues. And so let's start. I'm going to share a screen just so people can actually see some of these people. And I'm going to start with the first one on the screen is Gordon Hirabayashi, who is from the Seattle area, and he brought a very I think I could say unique perspective in his defiance of the government during World War II, when they started singling out Japanese Americans with curfews and things like that. So talk about Gordon and his role in your book.
Yeah, so Gordon is a real treasure of the Seattle area. He was such an interesting man. He was, and he's the one character in this book that I suspect a fair number of people from Seattle will have some familiarity with. But Gordon was a young man of very, very strongly held convictions. He was a Quaker. He was a pacifist. He believed very strongly in following the dictates of his conscience and not letting peer pressure or any other kind of pressure affect the course of the decisions he made in life. So in accordance with that, in the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor, one of the first things that happened in Seattle was that an 8 p.m. curfew was imposed on anybody of Japanese ancestry living in Seattle. So you couldn't be out on the streets after 8 p.m. Gordon deliberately defied that curfew. In fact, he made notations documenting when he was out after 8 p.m. And that in itself was an act of tremendous courage, because he was simply by doing that, he was taking on the government. He was in some ways challenging his family, or at least his family was seriously worried about the consequences of this kind of behavior. So that was the first thing Gordon did. And I think we have a clip of him talking about it.
Yeah, so this was comes from an interview I did with Gordon over 20 years ago, where he's talking about, as you were talking about, just, that decision to, go against that 8 p.m. curfew. So Gordon was a student at the University of Washington. sophomore sociology major, and he's in Suzuki Library studying with several other of his white classmates. And up to this point of the story, every night, because of the curfew, about 5 minutes to 8, he would just pack his bags, pack books in his bag, and then run home so that he would be back at home before the curfew. In this case, kind of, I would call it an epiphany in terms of what he did. So let's listen to this clip.
And one day, I'm dashing home. Hey, Gordon, it's 5 to 8. I grab my stuff, and it takes about 5 minutes to get home. So I'm just dashing home, and it hit me. A question that I should have faced earlier, it just hit me. How come I'm dashing home and all your timekeepers are still there? It just needed the question to be raised. I knew I couldn't answer it, without saying I can't do it. I turned around and went back to the library. Hey, what's the matter? And I said, well, you guys are here. We got work to do. I said, I got work to do too. I decided if you guys are here, I'm gonna work with you. I'll go back when you guys are ready to go. Nobody turned me in. And I didn't take that until it hit me. And when it hit me, I knew, gosh, I can't do it. That's two-faced.
And then in your book, you document not only did he defy the curfew, but he went further with that. Talk about that.
Yeah, so when the time came for Japanese Americans in his neighborhood in Seattle to get on the buses and be taken off to Puyallup, to what they called an assembly center there, to be incarcerated, Gordon just didn't get on the bus. And what he did instead was really interesting. At this point now, he's the last Japanese American living in Seattle. He sits down and he writes out a very carefully articulated statement outlining, sort of in broad constitutional terms, why he believes that both the curfew and the forced removal of people from their homes is wrong and unconstitutional. And he took that statement and he went downtown Seattle and he walked into the FBI office down there and handed this statement to the agent in charge. And the agent in charge that day didn't know what to do with this guy. I mean, this was literally the only person in Seattle who had taken this stance. And so, and at one point, Gordon said, put me in a car and take me down to Puyallup if you have to, but I'm not going to sign the registration form. I'm not going to sign the form that allows you legally to incarcerate me. So they spent the rest of the day driving Gordon around to different places in Seattle, trying to get him to sign this form, and he just wouldn't do it. And so at the end of the day, he wound up in the King County Jail, and that began a long process of trials and legal proceedings that wound up in the U.S. Supreme Court. But Gordon spent most of the war years in and out of jail and federal work camps and federal prison.
And throughout that process, the thing that struck me about Gordon, and as he told me the story, is he did it in such a gentle way. I mean, when I think of civil disobedience and how he went about it, it was always with the utmost respect for others, and which kind of astounded me because he was just so principled and so clear, but yet so compassionate and kind as he went through this whole process. It's just
and as with other great civil rights leaders, I think that personality had sort of unflappable, unmovable, but not aggressive, not violent, not confrontational, just sort of unflappable and unmovable personality he had stood him in good stead for the battle that he wound up fighting.
Yeah, in fact, the one time where he actually maybe some of that fell away was that time when he was in the King County Jail, and his parents. No, actually, it was the letter he got from his mother, where because the one thing that Gordon was most worried about was the impact on his family. And his mother in particular said, Gordon, don't do this because we don't know what's going to happen to you. We're going to get separated. And then he got that letter from his mother, who wrote how she really truly understood what he was doing. And when Gordon got that letter, how he just broke down and cried. That was the one time. But what Gordon did, what took so much courage, and I want to move on to the other guys. And the three other men actually served in the military with the 442nd. And what I love that what you did was, because when I think of the military service, I think a lot about the guys from the mainland who came from the camps. But you started off with Katsumiho, who was born and raised in Hawaii. And so this story was really fascinating. Here's a photograph of Katz when he was young, playing football. So talk a little bit about Katz and his role in the book.
Yeah, so Katsugo Miho grew up on Maui at a time when Maui and most of the islands were run basically as vast sugarcane and pineapple plantations, of course. So, a brutal, racially stratified system. But his family, Katz's family actually ran a little hotel on Maui. And he was a student at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened. In fact, he went up on the roof of his of Atherton House, the sort of residence hall where he was living, and he could see the attack on Pearl Harbor unfolding in front of him. In fact, a shell landed quite near Atherton House. And shortly after that, he heard on the radio that all the University of Hawaii students enrolled in ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, were to report to the campus immediately. So he put on his uniform and he ran across the street and went to, I think it was the armory on the campus. And there he found several hundred young ROTC cadets, most of them Japanese Americans, milling around, not quite sure what to do. That afternoon, even as the ships are still aflame in Pearl Harbor, Katz's ROTC group was formed into something called the Hawaii Territorial Guard. And they were issued these old, I think it was 1903 Springfield rifles and a few cartridges that they didn't even know how to load these guns, let alone shoot them. But that night, Katz found himself down on the Honolulu waterfront in a sort of an industrial area down there, patrolling in the dark back and forth to guard against what everybody expected would be an imminent invasion by the Japanese imperial forces. And so he was, Katz was very proud, like millions of other young men who were in uniform at that time. He was very proud to be able to do something to serve his country. But unfortunately, his term in the Hawaii Territorial Guard came to an abrupt and unforeseen end a few weeks later. And we have him talking about that.
Yeah, so here's the clip where Katz talks about it, and let's just go ahead and play it.
Our group of University of Hawaii students were dropped off as guards over area in the dark on 4-hour shifts, and for 2-3 nights in a row we were serving as, I don't know what we would have done, because we were given a loaded rifle. We were given a loaded rifle with 5 rounds of ammunition. We didn't even know how to fire the gun. But we were given this rifle. We were told, you load it this way, this is the way how you lock it in case anything happens. To this day I wonder, what was if anything happened was what they were referring to, because not that nothing happened, but what if anything had happened, what were we supposed to do, because we're not giving any kind of orders. A month and a half later, early in the morning, we got called up and said, hey, we're going to report down to Lanakila Intermediate School. And we woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. They woke us up at 2 o'clock. And then finally, about 5:30, a truck came by to pick us up. We were all fully packed and everything. We dropped us off at Lanakila. We wondered what was going on. We found out that the whole battalion was assembled at Lanakila. And then Major Frazier, who was the acting commander of the battalion, came up and told us point blank, right straight in our face, says, the reason why you are here this morning is because all you Americans of Japanese ancestry, I'm pretty sure you refer to Americans of Japanese ancestry, because of your ethnic background, you are being discharged herein right off the bat, right as of now, you are being discharged from the Hawaiian Territory. Only the AJAs. And completely still shocked.
Yeah, Katz is such a powerful storyteller because he have you one moment laughing, and then the next moment, tears could be rolling down your cheeks. But,
a lot of the young men, I mean, that was such a shock to them. A lot of the young men that were on that athletic field that morning, actually, Katz and some of the others mentioned that they could hear other young men crying in the darkness around them. It was such a slap in the face to be disrespected in that way and told that they couldn't serve simply because of their ethnic background. So that was a huge shock. And it was some time before Katz could do anything about that. But roughly a year later, the Roosevelt administration, after refusing to enlist Japanese Americans, sort of reversed itself, and it created, well, there was the two Army units that were all Japanese American segregated units, the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. So about a year later, Japanese Americans were allowed to join this combat team, and Katz, in fact, was one of those who signed up.
And the thing that you captured so well was their resilience. I mean, you mentioned how it felt like a slap in the face, but yet these men didn't turn their back, to what they felt their responsibility was, and they were doing volunteer work and just kept going, which is a story in itself, and there have been books just written about that. So let's pivot to the next person. So we'll come back to the mainland. We're going down to California, and the next person we're going to talk about is Rudy Tokiwa. And let me get So here's a photograph of Rudy in his Letterman's jacket, and we both enjoy the story of Rudy. I interviewed him. And I think through his interview, you get a sense of, he's kind of a rule breaker, kind of a rascal type of person. So talk about Rudy and his role in your book.
Yeah, so really interesting guy. Rudy grew up on a farm in Salinas, California. And shortly after Pearl Harbor, the FBI raided his home as it raided many, many Japanese American homes. In fact, when they raided the Tokiwa household, Rudy's father was a veteran of the World War I, and he had his uniform in a trunk. When the FBI agents came into the Tokiwa household, they opened this trunk, they found Rudy's father's uniform and said, "What is this?" Rudy's father said, "Well, I'm a veteran, I served in World War I." And they said something offensive about Japanese never serving in the U.S. Army, threw the uniform on the floor and trampled on it. Rudy was quick to anger sometimes, so that got his blood up right then and there. But Rudy's family was then shortly after that taken to the Salinas Rodeo grounds, an assembly center, so-called assembly center in Salinas. And from there, they were transported to Poston, Arizona, to permanent concentration camp in Poston. And this was actually one of the largest, I think it may have been the largest single camp, huge place. And so you can imagine what life was like in the Arizona desert in the summer. It was absolutely brutal, brutal place. But it was while Rudy and his family were in Poston that the 442nd was created. And when news got around the camp that there was now this all Japanese American fighting unit and that young men, Nisei men, were now being encouraged to enlist, a lot of debate broke out among the everybody in the camp, really, to some extent, but particularly among the young men of draft age. So they held a meeting down under some mesquite trees in the camp, and tried to figure out what to do about this. Some of them, quite a few of them, basically said, "Hell no, I'm not going to sign up to fight for this government that has me and my grandmother and my little sister and all my whole family living, behind barbed wire. That's the last thing in the world I want to do." But other young men at this meeting stood up and said, "Well, maybe if we fight, maybe we enlist and fight and bleed and some of us die in the war, that at least when the war's over and we come back home, surely things will be better for Japanese Americans in this country." And so Rudy was only 17 at the time, but Rudy was one of the young men that stood up and argued for enlisting. And so that's what he did. And from there, he was sent to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where basic training was held for the 442nd. And then they were sent off to first to Italy, where they fought.
And Dan, before we go to Europe, I really love the part where you talk about training in Camp Shelby, because I think back, I've interviewed dozens and dozens of these men who served during World War II, and when I interviewed them, they were Japanese American elders, and oftentimes, sort of advising me and telling me about life, and generally saw them as these gentle, kind individuals. What you captured, I think in particular, it was almost surprising to me, was how much fighting went on at Camp Shelby. Rudy was one of the instigators of several of them. Talk about that. I mean, what did you find in terms of where some of those battles showed up?
Yeah, well, actually, right from the beginning, part of the problem was that some of these young men were coming from Hawaii. A lot of them had grown up on plantations in Hawaii and spoke, for the most part, spoke Hawaiian Pidgin English. The other contingent, though, came from the mainland, and these were mostly kids who had grown up in Los Angeles or San Francisco or Seattle or Spokane or wherever. Many of them were college students. So these two groups came together at Camp Shelby, and they could not get along at all. I mean, just culturally, and particularly in terms of language. The Hawaii guys were speaking Pidgin. The mainland guys couldn't understand the Pidgin. That pissed off the Hawaiian guys, and pretty soon fistfights were breaking out all over camp. It got to the point, after a couple months of this, where the officer corps for the 442nd was considering disbanding the whole group, because there was so much infighting between these two groups. And it was only actually one of the chaplains for the 442nd got the idea of, well, the Hawaii guys just don't understand that the mainland guys are coming out of these camps, and they don't really get the idea of the camps. So they put a bunch of the Hawaii guys on buses, and they took them to Arkansas, where there happened to be two these concentration camps in Arkansas, not far from Mississippi. And for the first time, the guys from Hawaii, they saw Japanese Americans living behind barbed wire in really squalid conditions. Those Arkansas camps were swampy and malaria ridden and really, really particularly bad places. And so they saw these, saw the reality of what the mainland kids were coming from. And that began the process of sort of loosening up communications between the two groups. And, over time, they became extremely close. They became one of the, if not the most closely knit together and effective fighting forces in the American Army. So, but it took quite a while.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. You know, when I talk with them, just the closeness, and part of it was actually fighting each other and going through that. But then I think especially for the Hawaii guys, when they found out what the mainlanders, you know, went through and their families, it really shifted. And when I talked to some of the Hawaii people, I mean, they actually had tears talking about, you know, when they discovered it. And that really brought them together, which, you know, I think made a difference when they went to Europe, because they became one of the best fighting units in the U.S. Army. So talk about their fighting in Europe.
Yeah, so as I say, they were shipped first to Anzio in Italy, just as the Allies were breaking out of the beachhead at Anzio. And the 442nd fought their way up the Italian boot from hilltop town to hilltop town in Tuscany. If you've been to Tuscany, you know there's a town on top of almost every hill. Beautiful country. But the Germans held the high ground in every one of those towns. So the Nisei soldiers had to constantly be fighting their way uphill to take these towns and to rout the Germans out of there. But they did it very effectively. They took very heavy casualties. But eventually they wound up as far north as the Arno River. When they got to the Arno, they had by then built quite a reputation as a fighting force. In fact, the Germans had come to know of them and had begun to call them the Little Iron Men, and were quite afraid of them, actually. So the American commanders decided that they should be used on the French-German border. So they transported the 442nd to the Vosges Forest, which is on the Franco-German border. It's an area, mountainous area, very dark forested area. And they gave the Nisei soldiers the task of liberating a town called Bruyères, where a couple of roads and a railroad converged. By now it was November or October of 1944. It was rainy and cold and getting dark. It was muddy. It was miserable conditions. They fought for days and finally liberated this town of Bruyères, again taking very heavy casualties. But then they moved beyond Bruyères, deeper into the Vosges forest. They liberated a place called Bifontaine and a village called Belmont. And then finally, after days of this fighting, they were told that they could take a night or two to get some rest. So they went off and they found barns and haylofts and places and tried to get some sleep. But in the middle of the second night, their officers came through and woke them up and told them to put their combat gear on, that they were going back into battle. And none of them really knew what this was about. They didn't expect to be going back into combat so soon. But then they found themselves out in the torrential rain that night, heading up a mountain. What had happened is General Dahlquist was the overall commander of the division. It's often called the Texas Division. These were young men, mostly from Oklahoma and Texas National Guard, that formed the core of this division. Dahlquist had sent a number of his Texas soldiers too deep into the Vosges, and they had become surrounded and trapped out on the end of a ridge line, cut off from the rest of the American forces. They were surrounded. They were taking heavy casualties. Many of them were badly wounded, and they soon ran out of medical supplies and food and drinkable water. And so for several days, Dahlquist kept sending different units up to try to break through and get them out of there, and none of them could. So that's when he finally woke the Nisei troops up in the middle of the night and sent them up the mountain to try to get through to this Texas group that has come to be called the Lost Battalion. And they did. Again, that was the most hellacious fighting the 442nd saw. At times, again, the Germans had the high ground. These guys were fighting up very steep mountainsides with tanks aimed downhill at them, often taking tank rounds almost point blank. They finally broke through. They got to the lost battalion, and got them off, sent them on their way down the mountain. But they were not actually allowed to come down off the mountain themselves. They were ordered to fight on for several more days deeper into the Vosges. And it was only after several more days that they finally came down off the mountain. But when they did, their numbers had been absolutely decimated. K Company, which was the lead company, was down to just 17 men still able to walk. And Rudy was one of those men.
Yeah, so we're going to show a clip of Rudy talking about, coming off that, the fighting, and at full strength, the 442nd is around 4,000 men, and that's three fighting battalions, and then like headquarters and the other support staff. On that day, because of the casualties they had been taking that whole month, they were down to under 1,000 men left. And the general calls for a retreat parade. He wanted the 442nd to parade in front of him so he could acknowledge him with a salute. And here Rudy talks about what happened on that day.
The 36th Division commander wanted the 442nd to pass in review. And he said, all personnel of the 442nd will pass in review. So the 442nd passes in review, and like I say, you got 3 battalions plus headquarters, and they don't even have a battalion out there passing in review. So General Dahlquist turned around and he said to the colonel, when I order everyone to pass in review, I mean the cooks and everybody will pass in review. And Chaplain Yamada said, this is the first time I saw the colonel cry. And he said, this is all I have left.
Yeah, when I did that interview with Rudy, he goes on and talks about all the friends that he lost, and he teared up quite a bit, and he felt really bad about essentially the disrespect by the general, and him not realizing how much the unit suffered during those weeks.
Yeah, that clip, I remember that was one of the clips that I watched early when I first started looking in the Densho materials, and I remember that I teared up when my wife watched it with me. She was tearing up. It's a very powerful clip. Rudy was a tough guy, but he also had a really big heart, and you can see that there.
There were Arjana trips.
Yeah. So let's go to the the next person, and the next person we wanted to go to is Fred Shiosaki, and some sort of history here. So we talked a little bit about the camps, and 110,000 Japanese Americans were removed on the West Coast. To these camps, these concentration camps. Hawaii, they weren't removed, and if you were in places like Eastern Washington, you weren't removed. And Fred, was born and raised in the Spokane area. But talk about Fred and his role in the book.
Yeah, so Fred's family ran a laundry in Hilliard, down by the railroad yards in Spokane. And right after Pearl Harbor happened, he was one of the young men that went down to the draft office in Spokane and tried to sign up. And he was told that he couldn't sign up, that he was an enemy alien, which absolutely floored him. So he was absolutely crushed by that. He spent the next year sort of half-heartedly attending Gonzaga, but really feeling humiliated because he was one of the very few young men left in Spokane, not in uniform. So when the 442nd was created, he went back downtown and he signed up. although he didn't tell his parents until just a few days before he had to get on the train and go to Camp Shelby. But he went through basic training with all the others. And then Fred was one of those who was, as I say, the rescue of the Lost Battalion. There was K Company and I Company led the assault on that mountain. And they both took extremely heavy casualties. But Fred, like Rudy, was in K Company. So going up that mountain, he lost a lot of friends, and he had a very tough time of it. And I had a tough time after he came back home trying to get over it. And it took him quite a while to sort of get his feet back under him after coming back home.
Yeah, so this is our final clip, and I think it kind of shows some of the difficulties following the war. So after the war, as Fred was making his way back to Spokane, he's taking the train and he's in Washington D.C. And while he's at the train station, another soldier approaches him, and happens to be someone from the Lost Battalion, that Texas unit that the 442 saved. And so here's the clip of Fred talking about that.
I was on the train by myself, and we stopped in Washington D.C. And I was actually, from that railroad station, you could see the Capitol building. I'm sure that must have been the Union Station. And I was sitting there looking out the window, and this GI came out of books. I think he's a buck sergeant, and he stopped and he looked at me and he looked at my pants. He says, "Hey, you were the 442nd?" Yeah. He says, "Were you at the Lost Battalion?" And I said, "Yeah, I was there." He says, "I was in there."
So he was one of the 200 men that you rescued.
Yeah, anyway, it's one of those things. I could just feel myself getting I was angry, God, and I turned to him and I said, "Do you know how many men we lost getting you guys out of there? You know how many of my friends died in there?" And well, he said, "You know, if you guys were in there, we'd have come after you." And I shook my head and I said, "Well," he said, "anyway, I want to thank you." He put out his hand and I turned away and looked out the window.
Yeah, I remember when I interviewed Fred, I was actually surprised when he told me that story. I didn't expect him to not shake this other soldier's hand, but then, and he talked about, again, just how angry he was and how sad he was that he lost so many of his friends. And part of it was he not thinking that these white soldiers would actually save Japanese Americans if they were in that same situation. So it was a difficult time for him. And later on, I mean, it showed up, just in terms of when he went home and just dealing with this, post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that somewhere in these interviews, him talking about for quite some, when he got back to Spokane, he moved back in with his family in the apartment. They had an apartment over the laundry. He moved back in with his family for a while, and I know that his mother had to wake him up in the middle of the night frequently because he was screaming in his sleep. So, virtually all these guys came home with some degree of PTSD.
Yeah. So that kind of gives, kind of a summary of the four characters, kind of the arc of the book, for the audience. And at this point, I mean, there are some good questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to move to that, and I think other things will come up when we do that. And I just want to remind the audience, so if you have questions, now's the time to put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. But the first question, Dan, was, and you do this in a masterful way, the battle scenes. When you talked about things like the fighting in Italy and then later on in the Vosges, how did you recreate those battle scenes? How did you make them so realistic?
Yeah, so I mean, this is where the value of what you've done, Tom, comes in. To do that, to get sort of cut through the fog of war and create an accurate, honest assessment, moment by moment sort of tick-tock of what happened in a given battle. You need to hear from people that were there. And as I say, one of the great values of the Densho archive is that you have talked to so many people who were there at crucial moments, like the Lost Battalion or the battle for Hill 140, or any of these sort of major moments when there were these large battles. So it's really by listening to all these firsthand accounts, by studying the terrain, by reading whatever's been written about them by other people, and then sort of integrating all that, but trying to correlate the different accounts of what happened. And frankly, they don't always agree perfectly. And so then you have to figure out, okay, I've got an 80-year-old man here trying to tell me about something that happened in 1944. And here's another 80-year-old man telling me, and there's a discrepancy. And you just sort of have to weigh things out and judge them and figure out how to make it as accurate as possible. But in terms, for somebody like me that's never been in battle, this was my biggest single worry going into the book, is how, not having had any combat experience myself, how do I get this right? And it was really just by immersing myself in all those firsthand accounts that you've collected, Tom. And then there, as you know, there's others at the Japanese American National Museum and Go for Broke Educational Foundation and a number of other places, archives at the University of Hawaii. So there's actually a lot of material out there. And a large part of writing a book like this is sifting through it and finding the right people who were in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, and as we talk about this, a question just popped up from Dawn, which I think is good for you to address now. Is this book classified as nonfiction?
Excuse me. Yes, it is. I mean, I'm actually pretty rigorous about that. I do write in a novelistic style, and so I am creating scenes, but I spend an enormous amount of time getting the little kinds of details, like it might not occur to you, but I might need to know what time the moon came up over Bruyere on a particular night in 1944. Fortunately, a lot of that can be found now on the internet. There's sites where you can get that kind of data. So I do a lot of what I call micro research, getting the little tiny details that you would put into a novel if you were writing a novel, but in my case, I've got to actually find the facts before I can use them. So yes, it is absolutely nonfiction.
So here's another question from Anonymous. Does your book address the reasons that resulted in Japanese Americans being put into camps? In 2022, it seems a clear-cut travesty, but hindsight is 2020. FDR doesn't seem to have been a bad man, and I don't think he wanted to grab land owned by, like, for instance, Bainbridge Island Japanese Americans. So yeah, do you get into the reasons?
I do to some extent, and you can probably speak to this in more depth than I can, given what you've done. But, one of the things I discovered in doing the research, I spent quite a bit of time just doing some broad background research into anti-Asian sentiment going back in American history, starting with the Chinese immigrants coming to California during the gold rush and right after the gold rush. And then that era in American history where this notion of the yellow peril came up. It was so promulgated in the newspapers and also in Hollywood, where all these images and tropes and associations were developed, associating Asian and Asian immigrants in particular with locusts and snakes and vermin and rats, and in particular in bringers of disease. And those tropes, those ideas were there right from the days of Chinese immigration. They were there during this yellow peril period. They were very much there right in the wake of Pearl Harbor. And frankly, we've begun to see them same images and tropes coming up again in the last few years, sadly, in this country. So one thing I gained a greater appreciation for was sort of how deeply embedded anti-Asian ideas were in American culture before Pearl Harbor ever even happened. So, I mean, part of what happened in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, people were obviously outraged and extremely emotional about it. But there were already pre-made notions they could turn to in terms of channeling their hate. And I think to a large extent, people just gave into that much more than they should have. You know, I don't know that Roosevelt did. I grew up in a family that absolutely adored Franklin Roosevelt for a number of reasons. But clearly, the executive order that he issued and the consequences of that were just flat out wrong. And I think most people today would recognize that. I hope they would recognize that if it happened today. But I guess we can't be sure.
Yeah.
So sort of around and about, but Tom, you may have more.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things. I just wanted to, first emphasize, it was fascinating, while you're writing this book. So it's the last, 7 years. So it started, about 6 years ago when you really got into it. But this was, as you said, during a time when there were a lot of things in what we've talked about as you're writing, how things happening today were rhyming with what happened, back, in the early 1900s and then during the World War II era, and how things were being in some ways repeated. And in your epilogue, you also talked about kind of the redress era, where so the government did take the time to hold hearings, and through that, their findings were that there was no military necessity, and the real reasons were war hysteria, racial prejudice, and a failure of political leadership. And again, those themes kind of resonated with some of the things we're seeing today. So that's one, so those are a couple of thoughts. There are two other questions that are related. Karen Schneider asked about expanding your thoughts about the title of the book, and then an anonymous attendee said, why did you pick the title? And I wonder if a different title, more specific to your book's content, was considered. So talk about the title and when that you consider some other things.
Yeah. So the title came actually from my wife, and it sort of, to my mind, works on two levels. One is that the focus of the book is largely on the 442nd, although I bring in the camps and the families and many other things that surrounded the young men who fought in the 442nd. But it's largely about the actual experience of fighting in the 442nd. And so just sort of topographically, the reality is that these guys were always fighting their way up the side of some mountain against tremendous odds that were very much against them because of the terrain. There's another battle towards the end of the book where these guys literally scaled the back of a mountain in the middle of the night, broke through what was called the Gothic Line, surprised the Germans, and basically blew open that sector of Italy for the Fifth Army to move through. So topographically, it fit this notion of facing the mountain, having to go up the mountain. And then just also more broadly, to me, it sort of means that, right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans of all ages and genders and everybody, they all faced this sort of mountain of problems. On January 6th, their lives were going along in a certain way. They were running a flower shop or a farm, or going to UCLA, or whatever their lives may have been. And then on December 7th, suddenly there's this mountain of difficulties that they have to go through or around or over or somehow surmount. So for me, it operates also on that level.
Now, were there any other titles that came close that you almost went with? Do you remember?
Oh gosh, no. I'm terrible with titles, and frankly, I'm not sure this is the best title in the world. But I can't think of any of the others. I'm sorry, I can't think of any of the others. There was a lot of back and forth between me and the publisher, and going around and around about it. So
yeah, I remember you asking me, and we asked the staff, and we're all in the same way brainstorming different ideas. And
it's a complex book, and it sort of covers a lot of bases, and it was very hard to read. The Boys in the Boat was pretty easy to reduce to a simple phrase that got the idea across. This one was much more difficult.
So here's the last question for you, and this is a good one. No one's asked this one. The question is there anything that stands out that did not make it into the book? So was there something, a story, a person?
Oh, yeah.
That
there were people. For one thing, I know that there's somebody tuned in tonight who knew Fumie Miho, which is Katsumiho's sister. And she lived in Japan during the war. And her story is absolutely fascinating. And I do weave some of it into the book. But Fumie's life was so interesting, one really could write a book just about it. So I wish I could have spent more time on her. But there's also big subjects that I wasn't able to cover. There was, for instance, the Military Intelligence Service. Quite a number of young Japanese men were recruited into the MIS to serve as translators, primarily people who had good Japanese language skills. And they did a variety of different jobs, including in some cases being on the ground with fighting forces in Southeast Asia. So there's some wonderful stories involving the MIS that I couldn't get into. And then there's the whole 100th Infantry Battalion, which was another all Japanese American Army unit that fought absolutely heroically, especially in southern Italy, and amazing stories there too.
Yeah, I remember, we did an event at the Museum of Flight, and there was a display of Ben Kuroki, another interesting person who, was a, was it the Air Force? I mean, he flew, and he was like a gunnery kind of.
He flew a number of missions over Europe, was shot down, and then got back in the air and shot down again. Just amazing guy. At one point, he was going around from camp to camp, trying to recruit Nisei men to join the army.
Yeah,
but amazing. And then he wound up going to fight in the Pacific Theater later in the war. Yeah.
And so that was another, lots of interesting ones. So at this point, Ali, I'm going to bring you back to close the show.
Hello, thank you for that. So we are at about our time. I hate to sort of end this discussion. It's been so wonderful. In the last few minutes, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who showed up this evening. This has been such a wonderful talk. For anyone who'd like to get your hands on copies of Facing the Mountain, I'm going to go ahead and relink it in chat so it'll be easy for you to find. Go ahead and follow that link over to our website. Of course, audience members, let us know what you thought of this event, either in person or online. We always love to hear from you. Come on in and see us if you'd like to. We're totally open. Tom and Daniel, huge thank you for being here. This has been such an incredible conversation. Do you have any last things you'd like to share before we say goodnight?
No, just everybody stay cool out there.
I know we're in Seattle, so warm, pretty toasty here.
It is. We're not used to that around here.
No.
All right. So with that, I'm going to say one last good night. Shall we do the waving thing?
Let's do the waving thing.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.